Humanise by Thomas Heatherwick. Building exteriors matter. The outsides of buildings matter to everyone who goes past them. And the number of people passing by a building is a lot more than the number of people entering it. The outside of that building will affect every single one of those people. It will contribute to how they feel. As they walk down the street and they pass by dozens of buildings, they'll feel dozens of emotions. For every individual person that spends time inside an office or block of flats, there will be hundreds or even thousands of people that pass by the outside of that building every day. Architectural characteristics of the past 100 years. Over the last 100 years or so, the outsides of the ordinary buildings we pass by every day have taken on a certain look. It's present in towns and cities all over the world. This look has turned out to be astonishingly harmful. There's a word that describes the kinds of buildings I'm talking about. Boring. When too much boring happens in one space, it becomes harmful boring. Boring buildings aren't just a curse on the visual landscape. They're a curse on our mental health. They make us stressed and anxious and scared. Research on boring streets. In 2012, a neuroscientist called Colin Ellard traveled to New York City to analyze how people felt when they walked through a boring place and then through an interesting place. In front of the blank facade, people were quiet, stooped and passive, he wrote in his account of the study. At the livelier site, they were animated and chatty, and we had some difficulty reining in their enthusiasm. Ellard was also collecting data on the participants' emotional states from special bracelets that took regular readings from their skin. These bracelets were detecting a state that scientists call autonomic arousal. Autonomic arousal refers to how alert we are and how primed we are to respond to threat. It's a measure of stress. When Ellard checked the results, he discovered that people in the boring location weren't simply feeling nothing. Their autonomic arousal, their stress levels, had gone up. The effects of boredom. Boring is a state of psychological deprivation. Just as the body will suffer when it's deprived of food, the brain begins to suffer when it's deprived of sensory information. Boredom is the starvation of the mind. When the brain is deprived of information from its environment, it takes it as a signal that something is wrong. When we're bored, our stress hormone, cortisol, spikes. When cortisol levels are too high for too long, we become more susceptible to a variety of terrible illnesses, including cancer, diabetes, stroke, and heart disease. One major scientific survey in the UK found that those who report being bored are more likely to die younger than those who are not bored. Boringness has also been found to be an accelerator of a nasty range of negative behaviors. Reporting finds that boredom generates a higher risk of depression, drug addiction, alcoholism, anger, poor social skills, and low work performance. Humans are not well suited to a life of boredom. Boring buildings make us malfunction. Boring buildings are inhuman. Pre-modern architecture. In 1550, the Italian painter and architect Giorgio Vasari reflected old-school thinking when he wrote that architecture can only attain perfection in the hands of those who possess the highest judgment and good design, and who have had great experience in painting, sculpture, and wood carving. At first, Architects still had to undergo the same training in craftsmanship as the makers, but this requirement began to fade. Around the time that the Pantheon was being built, a Roman master builder and engineer called Vitruvius published the book on the subject of making buildings. In De Architectura, he wrote that buildings should have a combination of firmitas, utilitas, and venustas. The first word means strength. It shouldn't fall down. The second word means utility. It must usefully serve the purpose for which it was built. The third word refers to Venus, the Roman goddess who was the embodiment of beauty. Vitruvius was saying the final essential quality of buildings is that they should give joy. Buildings designed to look good and trigger positive emotions were usually, perhaps even always, interesting. They had depth, ornamentation, patterns, details, and often some curves. Grand and important buildings were made to be especially interesting. We used interestingness as a way of worshipping gods and rulers. The higher we held them in esteem and the more sacred they were, the more interesting were their buildings. This was true all over the world. Interestingness was seen as an unquestionable good. It seemed natural, universal, built into us. Modernism. Since the beginning of time, the buildings we made looked and felt human. But then, in the 20th century, that changed. Modernism was an artistic response to the birth pangs of the world we know today. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, almost everything we thought we knew about reality began to seem as if it was wrong. Old attitudes towards class, religion, and gender were beginning to crumble. The modernists despised all forms of ornamentation, whether flowery, overly descriptive writing or the frill and fancies of the decorative arts. Ornamentation was seen as banal, bourgeois, old-fashioned, and dishonest. For thousands of years, since the days of Vitruvius, and even before, it had been generally accepted that successful buildings should possess a combination of strength, utility, and beauty. Firmitas, utilitas, venustas. But now, one leg of Vitruvius's stool had been kicked away, the joy one. Le Corbusier, the god of boring. The god of boring. His real name was Charles-Édouard Jeanneret Gris, and he was a child of the modernist era. He called himself Le Corbusier, the crow-like one. Le Corbusier believed in the supreme importance of the function of the built world. If a canal and a railway track operated at maximum efficiency when they were perfectly straight, then perfectly straight was how they should look. Perfect straightness was their truth, and truth was what mattered. I'm going to list 7 of Le Corbusier's core beliefs. Belief 1. Decoration should be abolished. Decoration is suited to simple races, peasants and savages. The peasant loves ornament and decorates his walls. Belief 2. Cities should be built around straight lines. A modern city lives by the straight line. It is the proper thing for the heart of a city. The curve is ruinous, difficult, and dangerous. It is a paralyzing thing. Belief 3. Buildings should be designed for mass production. Belief 4. All buildings and places should be designed predominantly with straight lines and right angles. Belief 5. Streets should be abolished. Cafes and places for recreation would no longer be that fungus which eats up the pavements of Paris. They would be transferred to the flat roofs. Belief 6. Old cities and suburbs should be replaced by huge blocks surrounded by parkland. Belief 7. The insides of buildings matter more than their outsides. Summary of Le Corbusier's beliefs. Form should follow function. According to Le Corbusier, buildings were machines for living and working in, and that was how they should look. Anything that wasn't functional, any decoration, ornamentation, unnecessary curve, or mere attempt at beautification, was a betrayal of its truth. But here's the real truth of many of Le Corbusier's influential buildings. They've been rejected by the masses. Repetition and complexity. Humans seem to be drawn to repetition. We naturally appreciate order, symmetry, and patterns in artworks and objects. But we don't like too much repetition. Too much feels oppressively boring and tyrannical. Humans also like complexity. We gravitate to interesting things that invite us to look more in order to understand them. But complexity without any order or repetition can feel alarming and chaotic. What we like is just the right combination of repetition and complexity. Antoni Gaudi's Casa Milà has a predictable pattern: horizontal floors, vertical columns, a grid of windows, curves of limestone. But it's also incredibly complex. It's simply not possible to understand Casa Milà at a glance, as you can with so many modern buildings. It feels like a joyous three-dimensional puzzle that your brain is trying to solve. If you want to design a building that will be attractive to most human beings, repetition and complexity are vital tools. These forces can act as opposites, but they need each other. Psychological studies on architecture. One, people prefer buildings with complex features. Researchers have found that patterns in the absence of complexity repel us. Studies suggest that people are happiest in an urban environment when they find something new and interesting to look at, roughly every 5 seconds. Most people find beauty in patterned complexity. The bare concrete walls beloved by Le Corbusier and other modernists have been found to be hostile to humans precisely because of their lack of complexity. 2. Curves provide psychological comfort. The scientists found that people were far more likely to find the buildings with some curves beautiful than the purely rectilinear ones. When the participants were observing the curved architecture, the scientists saw increased activity in areas of the brain that process emotional reward. Meanwhile, brain scans by academics at the Harvard Medical School have shown that square and angled objects cause increased activity in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that helps us deal with stress and fear. 3. Architectural variation increases psychological restoration. This was demonstrated in 2012 by researchers from the University of Sydney in Australia and Uppsala University in Sweden. They wanted to find out what kind of urban scenes give people the benefit of psychological restoration. They discovered that greater architectural variation, both in the silhouettes of the buildings and in their surface details, increased psychological restoration. 4. People tend to be kinder on streets with small shops. Researchers in Seattle found that passers-by are 4 times more likely to help strangers in need on lively streets filled with lots of small shops than on pristine but essentially characterless blocks. Lead researcher Charles Montgomery explained, "People are nicer to each other when they move more slowly and have time to make eye contact." 5. Modernist-style public towers depress people. Most studies find that residents of these kinds of properties are less satisfied with their homes, more stressed, less optimistic, and more depressed. Book review. So far, the content was an excerpt from Thomas Heatherwick's book, Humanise. Unlike most architects, Heatherwick didn't receive formal training in architecture. He studied furniture design and later naturally expanded into architecture. Today, he's a globally renowned designer known for creating unique buildings and developing his own design philosophy. In 2023, he completed Azabudai Hills in Tokyo, a modern and nature-friendly space that's become hugely popular. He's also created projects in countries like the US, South Korea, China, Singapore, and South Africa. In his book, Heatherwick critiques the dullness of modern architecture, blaming it on architects who focus too much on theory and intellectual superiority. He calls out their elitism, saying they use complex jargon instead of making buildings that truly connect with people. He also addresses the issue of high costs in architecture and suggests ways to design creative buildings more affordably. This book isn't just for architects. It's great for anyone interested in creative work of any kind. Even if you don't fully agree with Heatherwick's ideas, the book encourages you to think deeply about what it means to be a creator and helps you reflect on the right attitude for it. At the end of the day, everything in the world, buildings included, is temporary. What lasts forever is our soul. Heatherwick reminds us that it's not about what you create, but about seeing things from a higher perspective, understanding others, and becoming a better, more compassionate person.